Buried beneath decades of silence, scattered among fading ink and crumbling paper, lies a version of the Second World War that official histories rarely dare to confront. The war we think we know was written in speeches, medals, and victory parades. But within the locked drawers of intelligence services, in file rooms stamped top secret and do not release before 2045, exists another record, one written not with triumph, but with the calculated cruelty of expedience, deception and sacrifice. These were not battlefield victories sung in songs, but hidden maneuvers orchestrated in shadows, where human lives became expendable markers on a board of strategy. In the silence of cold archives, words like directive, operation, and file number conceal acts so brutal that both victors and defeated had reason to bury them. It is within these suppressed documents that we find truths too incendiary for post-war politics. Stories of poisoned wells, betrayed soldiers, ghost convoys, and massacres erased from memory. Each is a fragment of forbidden history, long concealed from the public eye, deliberately redacted, mislabeled, or destroyed to preserve the illusion of order. Tonight, these fragments resurface, not as myths, not as rumors, but as classified accounts stripped of propaganda, revealing what was never meant to be spoken aloud. These are not the tales of generals at podiums, but of forgotten civilians, betrayed troops, and intelligence officers who left trails of secrets buried in bureaucratic dust. Once opened, these files cannot be closed again. Welcome to the hidden war you were never meant to know. Chapter 1. The Poisoned Wells of Eastern Poland. The winter of 1941 was brutal, even by the standards of the Eastern Front. Villages across Eastern Poland, territory first seized by the Soviets in 1939, then invaded by the Wehrmacht in June 1941, were reduced to frozen husks, their wells and rivers iced over under a sky choked with smoke from burning farms. But in the secret records of Soviet state security, a file marked NKVD Directive 12-47 carried a simple, chilling order. Deny the enemy sustenance, contaminate water sources, operatives to ensure no retreat without execution of measures. For decades, this directive remained hidden, misfiled in Soviet archives, its implications too dark, even for Stalin's wartime propaganda machine. It described not only the poisoning of wells to slow the German advance, but also the deliberate targeting of civilian populations who depended on those same water supplies. Reports from German Army Group South in late July 1941 noted an unprecedented outbreak of cholera spreading through units stationed near the city of Lwów. Field hospitals reported over 4,000 cases in 1 week, many soldiers dying before reaching the front lines. Wehrmacht medical officers initially attributed the epidemic to poor hygiene and contaminated food, but intercepted radio transmissions between NKVD field detachments in Tarnopol and Kiev suggested otherwise. Using crude chemical agents, arsenic salts dissolved into water troughs, livestock wells poisoned with phenol, the Soviets carried out a scorched earth tactic designed to leave nothing usable for the enemy. What went unmentioned in these reports was the fate of the local villagers, Polish farmers, and Jewish families trapped between retreating Soviet troops and advancing German divisions. They too drank from the poisoned wells, and their deaths were quickly dismissed as inevitable civilian losses of war. The evidence resurfaced in 1992, when Soviet chemical warfare archives were briefly opened during the chaotic dissolution of the USSR. Researchers uncovered testimonies from Red Army engineers describing how they had been ordered to render water supplies unfit for human use, often under direct supervision of NKVD officers. One report, dated August 12, 1941, noted proudly that entire enemy regiment incapacitated due to water contamination. Yet the cost was not confined to soldiers. Parish records from rural Galicia show entire villages vanishing from census rolls within weeks. The deaths marked only as epidemic casualties. The overlap between Soviet engineering reports and these sudden population drops leaves little doubt. The NKVD had weaponized disease as both shield and punishment. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 explicitly banned the use of chemical and biological weapons, but Stalin's regime treated treaties as tools for others to follow. To admit to such actions would have risked international condemnation, not only from enemies but from allies. British intelligence in Bletchley Park, decrypting fragments of Soviet signals traffic, picked up references to contaminated supplies and sanitation operations. Yet Churchill's cabinet suppressed the intelligence, fearing public knowledge of Soviet war crimes would fracture the fragile alliance holding the Grand Coalition together. A memo in the British Foreign Office file, FO 371-29987, reads, "While regrettable, such measures are to be regarded as internal Soviet defense policy. Disclosure not advisable." Thus, knowledge of the poisoned wells was quietly buried in diplomatic silence. Eyewitness accounts only strengthen the case. In 1943, a German officer named Kurt Reimann, later interrogated by the Americans at Camp Ritchie, described stumbling into a deserted Polish hamlet where the entire population had perished overnight. Horses lay foaming at the mouth, and half-frozen villagers were found collapsed beside their buckets. Reimann believed at the time it was typhus, but post-war comparisons of his notes to NKVD chemical files revealed a striking consistency. The use of arsenic trioxide, tasteless and deadly in small doses. Soviet engineers had carried small vials of the powder, dispersing it before retreating eastward. The villagers had been reduced to collateral, their deaths erased from history, so that neither Berlin nor Moscow would face responsibility. The strategic logic was ruthless. In the first months of Operation Barbarossa, Stalin feared total collapse. If German supply lines could be slowed by even a few days, it might give the Red Army time to regroup behind the Dnieper. Poisoning wells was cheaper than blowing bridges, more efficient than laying mines. But this tactic left a scar that extended far beyond the battlefield. Survivors who fled to neighboring regions spoke in whispers of cursed wells and rivers that killed entire families. Their testimonies, recorded after the war by Polish resistance units, were dismissed as folklore. Only with the unsealing of Soviet archives half a century later did those whispered warnings match the clinical coldness of NKVD directives. Historians attempting to verify the scale of this program face a grim obstacle. Most of the relevant NKVD files were deliberately destroyed in 1947, under orders from Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's notorious security chief. The surviving fragments exist only because they were misfiled or copied into chemical warfare manuals. Yet even those fragments are damning. They describe pilot programs in Ukraine, broad contamination operations in Belarus, and emergency execution of denial measures in Poland. A chilling phrase recurs in several documents: civilian impact, negligible. But the mass graves, the vanished villages, and the parish records tell another story. Civilian impact was catastrophic, and the truth was quietly effaced. In 2001, when Polish researchers presented evidence to the Russian State Duma seeking acknowledgement of Soviet responsibility, the response was silence. Moscow denied any involvement, dismissing the records as forgeries of émigré provocateurs. Yet the fingerprints of truth remain. The outbreaks of disease align too neatly with Soviet retreats. The British Foreign Office memos confirm the intelligence intercepts. And most damning of all, the NKVD directives themselves speak in the language of cold bureaucratic murder. These were not battlefield accidents. They were calculated policies designed to weaponize nature itself against both foe and neighbor. The poisoned wells of eastern Poland stand as a hidden war crime, unprosecuted and unacknowledged. They expose a chilling truth, that for the Soviet state, the very earth and water of occupied lands could be turned into instruments of death. Families who survived told their children never to drink from abandoned wells, never to trust flowing rivers after soldiers passed through. That inherited fear outlived the war, a cultural memory of invisible death. And yet, in official histories, it is absent. Sanitized narratives speak of battles and treaties, but not of arsenic in a villager's bucket, not of children dying in agony because their water was turned into a weapon. The hidden file marked 1247 reveals more than just a tactic. It reveals the lengths to which regimes will go, and the lives they are willing to erase, to win a war that demanded silence as much as sacrifice. Chapter 2. Churchill's Secret Bargain at Dieppe. The beaches of Dieppe, on the northern coast of France, still carry the echoes of August 19, 1942. At dawn that morning, more than 6,000 men, most of them young Canadian soldiers, were sent ashore in what official histories described as a raid to test German defences. Within hours, the operation collapsed into catastrophe. Nearly 3,600 were killed, wounded or captured. Tanks bogged down in shingle, landing craft burned, and machine gun fire turned the beaches into slaughter grounds. For decades, this was explained as a miscalculation, a failed rehearsal for the later D-Day landings. But hidden within declassified cables and British intelligence files marked Most Secret X-19 lies a far more disturbing truth. The Dieppe raid was not a rehearsal at all, but a deliberate sacrifice carried out for political leverage. The documents reveal that Winston Churchill authorized the operation not with hopes of success, but to prove to Joseph Stalin that Britain was serious about opening a second front, an illusion paid for with Canadian lives. The story begins months earlier. By spring 1942, the Soviet Union was under relentless assault, its cities burning and millions of soldiers dead or captured. Stalin sent urgent pleas to his Western allies: open a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. Churchill knew Britain was not ready for a full invasion. Resources were thin, shipping lanes stretched, and the Americans were only beginning to mobilize. But he also knew that refusing Stalin outright risked fracturing the alliance. And so, a plan was born. A limited raid that would look like commitment, but was never designed to succeed. In a memorandum preserved in War Cabinet papers, Churchill wrote, "Action, regardless of outcome, must be visible to Stalin. Political effect outweighs tactical necessity." These words, stamped with his initials, condemned thousands of men to a mission already doomed. What makes the Dieppe files so haunting is the evidence that intelligence already knew the raid would fail. Ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park, later unsealed, show that the Germans had reinforced the coastal defences weeks before the raid. The Gestapo and Abwehr both reported unusual Allied naval movements in the Channel. Yet the raid was launched anyway, with Canadian troops instructed to storm beaches, heavily defended by concrete bunkers and artillery emplacements. British intelligence officer Ian Fleming, later famous as the creator of James Bond, was present offshore with a special commando unit codenamed 30AU. His mission was not to rescue or support the troops, but to seize German cipher material from local headquarters. Even this, records suggest, was a secondary priority. The real objective was symbolic: to show Moscow blood on the beaches. Canadian veterans who survived the raid often recalled being told the mission was of supreme importance, but they were never told that Allied High Command had dismissed their chances of survival as negligible. In a declassified SOE briefing, an unnamed planner admitted, "Enemy positions known, casualty estimates high, strategic value, political." That phrase, political value, appears again and again in the Dieppe documents. When the operation failed as predicted, Churchill cabled Stalin within hours, stressing that British and Dominion forces have struck at Fortress Europe. Proof of commitment, regardless of cost. Stalin's response, cold and terse, acknowledged the gesture, but pressed harder for a true second front. The Canadians, meanwhile, were left in German prison camps or buried beneath the stones of Dieppe, the concealment of Dieppe's true purpose extended far beyond. 1942, post-war histories published by the British Ministry of Defence continued to describe it as a necessary rehearsal for Normandy, citing lessons learned about beach landings, tank mobility, and air support. While it is true that planners studied Dieppe's failures when preparing for D-Day, the idea that this was the raid's original intent collapses under archival scrutiny. The lessons were learned not by design but by accident. The operation's planners never intended it as a controlled experiment. They intended it as a spectacle of sacrifice, a blood-soaked performance staged for Soviet eyes. The deception was so complete that even Canadian families mourning their dead believed their sons had died for a strategic trial, not a diplomatic gesture. A particularly damning set of papers emerged in the 1970s, when portions of SOE archives were unsealed. Among them was File AHS 7 Sawandra 47, containing correspondence between Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, and Churchill himself. Mountbatten, often blamed for the raid's failure, privately warned that the operation had virtually no chance of achieving its stated military objectives. Churchill's reply was chillingly pragmatic. "Objective is not victory, but demonstration. Losses regrettable but acceptable." In later interviews, Mountbatten denied receiving such orders, but the paper trail in the archive tells a different story. It is here, in these memoranda and cables, that the bargain of Dieppe becomes unmistakable. For the Canadians, the raid left a scar that never healed. Soldiers of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Essex Scottish Regiment, and the South Saskatchewan Regiment were cut down before even reaching the seawall. Tank crews of the Calgary Regiment watched their Churchill tanks sink into the shingle, immobile targets for German guns. Survivors recalled the water running red as landing craft tried to retreat under fire, and yet, in official commemorations, their suffering was wrapped in the language of noble sacrifice, their true betrayal hidden behind platitudes. Only in private did some veterans speak of being sent to die for politics. Churchill himself never admitted the bargain. In his memoirs, he framed Dieppe as a costly but necessary experiment, one whose lessons paved the way for Normandy. Yet those who have read the unredacted files know better. The raid was never meant to succeed. It was meant to buy Churchill time, to buy him leverage with Stalin, and to show the Americans that Britain was still capable of striking Europe's coast. The price was paid in Canadian blood, a debt never acknowledged by the government that ordered it. When asked years later about the raid, Churchill reportedly muttered, "Without Dieppe, we might have lost Russia." To those who know the truth, it was not Russia that was saved, but the fragile facade of alliance, purchased at the cost of thousands of young men who never knew they were bargaining chips in a game of grand strategy. The secret bargain at Dieppe remains one of the most haunting buried truths of the Second World War. It reveals not only the cruelty of wartime politics, but also the fragility of historical memory. For decades, the official story painted Dieppe as tragedy with purpose, but the declassified files show it for what it was: a calculated act of deception, a sacrifice dressed as strategy, and a betrayal of men who deserved far more than silence. Chapter 3: The Ghost Convoys of Murmansk. Between the Arctic Circle and the frozen ports of northern Russia lay one of the most perilous lifelines of the Second World War, the Murmansk and Arkhangelsk convoys. Braving U-boat wolf packs, Luftwaffe bombers, and treacherous seas, Allied merchant sailors carried tanks, aircraft, food, and munitions under the Lend-Lease program, sustaining the Soviet war machine during its darkest hour. Official histories describe their heroism, their staggering losses, and their ultimate success. But sealed in Soviet naval logs and British Admiralty records exists another darker layer to the story: the ghost convoys. These were ships that were never meant to reach port, sacrificial fleets dispatched into the icy North Atlantic not for delivery, but to serve as bait. The plan was codenamed Operation Cold Veil, and it condemned thousands of sailors to death so that others, carrying the true cargo, could slip through unnoticed. The evidence first emerged in fragments. In the Soviet archive file Red Star 91, historians discovered references to phantom convoys dispatched in winter 1942. Cross-referenced with British Admiralty records, the picture became clearer. Convoys like PQ-17, remembered for catastrophic losses, were not simply victims of poor planning or bad luck. They were deliberately exposed. British decrypts had shown that German intelligence tracked the convoy, and yet the Admiralty issued the fatal order: scatter. Over 2/3 of PQ-17's ships were sunk, with hundreds of sailors freezing to death in the water. Later documents revealed that a shadow convoy, sailing further south under radio silence, reached Murmansk almost unscathed. PQ-17 had been the shield, the visible sacrifice to distract the wolf packs and the Luftwaffe. What makes these ghost convoys haunting is not only their fate, but the deliberate deception of those aboard. Merchant sailors, many of them Norwegian, British, and American civilians, were never told they were bait. They believed their mission vital, only to discover, if they survived, that their lives had been gambled away in a strategy they could neither question nor refuse. Reports from survivors describe the bitterness of watching other convoys sail home safely, while theirs was decimated. Families were told their loved ones died in storms, or that the losses were tragic accidents of war. The truth, locked in classified memoranda, was that their ships were marked for sacrifice before they even left Icelandic ports. Declassified British Admiralty papers confirm the scale of the deception. A file dated October 1942, stamped "Most Secret Convoy Strategy," outlines the Cold Veil Directive. Where risk is high and cargo considered expendable, convoy may be designated as diversionary. Objective is protection of priority shipments. Crew not to be informed. The language is chilling in its detachment. Cargo could be expendable. Lives could be expendable, but the illusion of continuous supply had to be maintained. The Soviet Union needed weapons, and the Allies needed Stalin's armies to keep fighting. The loss of a convoy, however catastrophic, could be written off as the price of sustaining the Eastern Front. The human toll was immense. On convoys like PQ-13, PQ-17 and PQ-18. Ships burned in the night sky as Luftwaffe Heinkel bombers swooped down, their machine guns cutting across the decks. Survivors described the sound of torpedoes in the water, the sudden eruption of fire as ships exploded, and the desperate minutes in lifeboats before freezing seas claimed them. Out of hundreds of merchant ships sent north, over 100 were sunk, and more than 3,000 sailors perished. Many left no grave but the ocean. Yet the full story of why so many convoys were abandoned, why orders came down to scatter instead of fight, remained locked behind layers of classification. Only the Cold Veil files explain the grim pattern. Some convoys were never intended to survive. What makes the story even darker is the Allied suppression of survivor testimony. Sailors who questioned why their convoys had been left unprotected were silenced or discredited. In Canada and Britain, families who pressed for answers were told the details were classified for national security. Soviet sailors who survived were ordered never to speak of diversionary operations, under penalty of imprisonment. Even decades later, when veterans held reunions to commemorate the Murmansk runs, the topic of ghost convoys remained taboo. Official speeches celebrated their courage, but omitted the fact that some had been consigned to die not by the enemy, but by the very governments they served. In 1995, when a batch of Soviet naval files was unsealed, the extent of the cover-up became undeniable. Orders signed by Admiral Arseny Golovko, commander of the Soviet Northern Fleet, explicitly referenced sacrificial diversions to protect high-priority shipments of tanks and aircraft. One chilling line reads, "Sailors understand risk. Their deaths will shield comrades. History will not record their loss as deliberate." When cross-referenced with British communications from the Admiralty, the parallel language confirms joint planning. Churchill himself, in marginal notes on one memorandum, scribbled, "If sacrifice buys Stalin's trust and supplies his war, it is a necessary exchange." The blunt pragmatism of such words is staggering, reducing human beings to counters on a strategic ledger. The story of the ghost convoys forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about wartime leadership. The men who ordered them, Churchill, Stalin, and their admirals, saw themselves as guardians of civilization against fascism. To them, sacrifice was a necessity, not a choice. But for the men on the decks of those doomed ships, shivering under Arctic winds and staring at the grey horizon, the sacrifice was not an abstract calculation. It was fire in the sky, screams in the water, and the knowledge that their deaths had been written into the plan before the first anchor lifted. That knowledge was buried under decades of silence, its traces confined to dusty archives where phrases like "cargo expendable" concealed a human tragedy on a massive scale. Today, when the story of the Murmansk convoys is told, it is usually framed as one of endurance and bravery. That much is true. The sailors who braved the Arctic earned their place in history. But hidden beneath that narrative is a darker truth, that many of those sailors sailed on ghost convoys, doomed before they left port, sacrificed for a strategy the world was never meant to know. Their courage remains, but so does the betrayal, preserved in secret files that tell a story of war fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with silence, deception, and expendable lives. Chapter 4: The Forgotten Massacre of Bleiburg. In May 1945, as the war in Europe came to its violent end, a forgotten chapter of atrocity unfolded on the Austrian-Yugoslav border. It was here, near the small town of Bleiburg, that tens of thousands of retreating soldiers and civilians, Croatian Ustaše, Sloven homeguards, Serbian Chetniks, Montenegrin separatists, and ordinary families were caught in the machinery of post-war retribution. They believed they were marching towards safety, hoping to surrender to British forces stationed in Austria. They carried white flags, children in their arms, carts laden with meager possessions. But instead of refuge, they found betrayal. Under orders concealed within Foreign Office file FO 371-48094, British commanders forced them back across the border into the waiting arms of Tito's Yugoslav partisans. What followed has no place in celebratory war narratives. The massacre of Bleiburg, a killing so vast and so deliberately silenced that it remains absent from many official histories even today. The scale of the retreat was immense. In early May 1945, as the Reich collapsed, entire columns of Axis-aligned troops and civilians streamed northward, desperate to avoid Soviet capture. The Croatian Ustaše regime, infamous for its brutality, led the exodus. But alongside them, were civilians terrified of partisan revenge. Estimates suggest over 200,000 people gathered in long convoys of carts, horses, and exhausted men in ragged uniforms. British intelligence officers monitoring the movement referred to it in dispatches as the Southern Exodus. To many in those columns, the British flag represented survival. They had heard that surrendering to the Western Allies offered fair treatment under the Geneva Convention. But documents later revealed that London had already reached an understanding with Moscow and Tito. Repatriation, not asylum, would be the fate of those who crossed into Austria. At Bleiburg, the betrayal unfolded. On May 15, 1945, British Fifth Corps officers received surrender envoys from the Croatian forces. The envoys begged for safe passage and asylum. The British officers stalled, sending cables to headquarters. The reply, marked urgent political considerations, was cold. Return of these groups to Yugoslav control is policy. No exceptions. That same afternoon, the mass of soldiers and civilians was herded back across the border, under armed guard toward waiting partisan units. Survivors later recalled the despairing silence as people realized they were being marched to death rather than safety. The massacres began immediately. In meadows outside Bleiburg, men were lined up and gunned down with machine guns. Prisoners were marched in columns, beaten with rifle butts, and executed in ditches. Others were forced on what survivors called the death marches. Endless treks through forests and fields, where exhaustion and starvation claimed as many as bullets did. Civilians fared no better. Women and children were separated from men, many never seen again. Witnesses spoke of entire families collapsing by the roadside, their bodies left unburied. The violence was not spontaneous. Decrypted Yugoslav transmissions confirm that Tito's command had issued orders to liquidate collaborators swiftly, preventing trials or tribunals that might complicate post-war settlements. British complicity was quietly erased from public record. Reports filed by Red Cross observers who attempted to intervene were classified and buried. One report described fields awash in blood, bodies numbering in the thousands, but it was sealed under the Official Secrets Act. In London, the massacre was dismissed as chaotic reprisal killings. In Belgrade, it was celebrated privately as revolutionary justice. Neither side wished to publicize the scale of the crime. In one chilling annotation found in FO 371-48094, a Foreign Office official wrote, "A necessary silence has been agreed. Public disclosure not in Allied interest." Thus, for decades, Bleiburg was not spoken of in history books, its victims uncounted, its perpetrators shielded by Cold War pragmatism. The survivors who managed to flee into Austria carried their trauma in silence. Many emigrated to Canada, Australia, and Argentina, forming diaspora communities that whispered of Bleiburg but found little audience in the wider world. Their testimonies, collected decades later, describe endless lines of prisoners, the stench of decay, the sound of gunfire echoing in valleys. Some recall British officers turning away mothers begging for mercy, telling them, "This is not our affair." These voices, ignored for half a century, reveal a betrayal as profound as the massacre itself. The betrayal of those who trusted in Allied promises of justice. For historians, reconstructing Bleiburg has been a battle against deliberate erasure. Yugoslav archives remain heavily redacted, with key files missing or destroyed. British archives, though partially opened, still contain sealed folders marked for restricted access. Yet fragments tell the story. In Austrian police records, unexplained mass graves were catalogued in the late 1940s. In Red Cross correspondence, quiet references appear to forced repatriations and unrecorded executions. In the oral histories of survivors, patterns of atrocity emerge with heartbreaking clarity. Though exact numbers remain contested, scholars estimate between 50,000 and 100,000 people were killed in the Bleiburg massacres and subsequent marches. What unites the evidence is not just the scale of the slaughter, but the deliberate decision to conceal it. The massacre of Bleiburg is forgotten, not because it lacked witnesses, but because it served no one's political narrative. For the British, acknowledgement would have meant admitting complicity in forced repatriations, in violation of international law. For the Soviets and Tito, it would have undermined the heroic myth of partisan liberation. For the emerging Western alliance, it threatened to destabilize relations in the early Cold War. Thus, silence became policy. Silence became survival for governments eager to move forward, leaving behind a trail of bones beneath Yugoslav soil. Today, Monuments stand at Bleiburg, erected by diaspora communities, yet even they are contested, vandalized, or removed amid political disputes. The dead remain without justice, their massacre referred to in official documents only obliquely as liquidations or settlements. But in the classified archives, the truth speaks plainly. Men, women, and children were slaughtered, not in the chaos of war, but in the cold aftermath of victory. And the silence of those who knew, those in London, in Belgrade, in Moscow, was not ignorance. It was choice, a choice to bury the evidence, to erase the voices, and to allow the massacre of Bleiburg to vanish into the shadows of history, where only forbidden files and the memories of survivors could keep it alive. In the silence between the turning of pages and the closing of steel drawers, we are left with questions that history books seldom ask. What else lies buried in sealed archives, concealed by governments who once spoke of liberty while committing acts of quiet betrayal? From poisoned wells in eastern Poland to Canadian soldiers sacrificed on the beaches of Dieppe, from ghost convoys sent to die in Arctic waters to the massacre at Bleiburg erased by diplomatic convenience, the pattern is unmistakable. Wars are not only fought with armies, but with secrecy. Secrecy that can outlast the lives of those it consumes. The civilians who drank from poisoned wells never knew their deaths were written into a directive. The sailors of the ghost convoys never knew their voyages were already condemned. The men of Dieppe never knew they were bargaining chips in a political game. And the families at Bleiburg never knew their pleas for sanctuary would be answered with silence. These stories, once hidden in the language of classified and most secret, now resurface as fragments of a darker war. They force us to confront not only the cruelty of enemies, but the cold calculations of allies. And as new archives open, as fresh files are declassified, the possibility remains that other buried truths wait in the dust. Truths that will challenge everything we believe about sacrifice, victory, and the price of survival. The question lingers: how much of history is still hidden in locked cabinets? And how many silences are still being kept?